Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first edition of the new AFA Speaker Series, Airmen in the Fight. In this new series, we'll hear from operational air and space forces, our Department of the Air Force warfighters around the world. As we begin, though, today, I'd like to take just a minute to remember the loss just this morning of one of our airmen flying an F-15C Eagle from Lake Kenneth Air Base. And as we've lost this young pilot, it reminds us to always remember the selfless courage and sacrifice of all our airmen and space professionals around the world. So our hearts and prayers go out to the 48th Wing, the Liberty Wing. Well, as you know, I'm your host today, Orville Wright, president of your Air Force Association. And I'd like to take a moment to thank all the sponsors who helped us today to make this first event in our speaker series possible. Collins Aerospace, Elbit, General Dynamics, GE Aviation, L3 Harris, Lockheed Martin, NextEra Energy, Oracle, Pratt & Whitney, our Pentagon Federal Credit Union, the Roosevelt Group, and SAIC. Our guest today, as you all know, is Major General John Shaw, the Combined Force Space Component Commander at U.S. Space Command and Commander, Space Operations Command in our new U.S. Space Force. General Shaw's background is really incredible. Besides being a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy with a degree in astronautics, he has been all in on space operations throughout his entire career. We can't thank John enough for his decades of selfless service to our air and our space forces and their families. As you know, the Space Force became the newest branch of our armed forces last December. Its core mission is to organize, train, and equip space forces to protect U.S. and allied interests in space and to provide space capabilities to the joint warfighting force. And just last month, the Space Force had more than 8,500 active duty airmen volunteer to transfer to the Space Force. And it is truly a great time to be a Space Force leader. So welcome again, John, and thanks so much for taking time from what we know is a very busy schedule to join us today. General Shaw, over to you, and thanks again.
Well, thanks, General Wright, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thanks also to our sponsors, and also condolences on the passing of our pilot there at Lake Kenneth. It's a reminder that serious business that we're in and day out. I thought I would start by talking, who is this guy on the camera that you're listening to right now, and how did we get to where we are? So if we go back just 1 year ago, Major General Stephen Whiting was sitting in the chair I have now, but he had two different titles than the ones that General Wright mentioned. Just a year ago, it was 14th Air Force, the numbered Air Force within our U.S. Air Force on the organized, train, equip side that had its headquarters here. And also back then, we didn't yet have a U.S. Space Command or a CIFSIC. It was GIFSIC, and it was a component that reported to STRATCOM. And so in the space of a very short time, so we fast forward just 6 months to winter of right before Christmas, when the Space Force stood up. We went through a change where 14th Air Force was redesignated Space Operations Command within the U.S. Space Force. I was as surprised as many people to find that my job title had kind of changed very quickly. But in a sense, our mission didn't change at all. We just kept doing organized, train, equip activities, and we just had a different name in a different service. Also, go back a little further last year, U.S. Space Command stood up on the 29th of August, and in early October, we formally stood up the component underneath U.S. Space Command, the joint component, called CIFSIC, Combined Force Space Component Command. So that command has not really been that old either. And so I have it's really a dream job, really, for those in the space business, to have a chance to be in command and be able to do it in both a joint hat and a service hat is really a special thing. And to do it out here in the beautiful central coast of California is special. You might notice I got a little sun over the weekend doing some biking around base and on totally beautiful weekend here at Vandenberg. So with that as sort of a backdrop, I thought I would talk about, first I'd talk about in my joint hat, what do I see as kind of 4 key challenges for us as we're moving forward with space as now a warfighting domain. Uh, the first I would say is, well, probably I could start with let me start with an analogy that kind of tries to convey how we got to where we are with space as a warfighting domain. And so the AFA folks will please forgive me for using a maritime domain analogy for something in our space and air service here. But really, for about 3 decades, we had the equivalent of a merchant marine in space. We were delivering capabilities to the fight, but the domain in which we were operating was a placid one. It was a benign one. No one was attacking our capability sets there. And I think I like to think we can go back probably to what we call the first space war, the Gulf War in 1991, where we first started to integrate space capabilities in that fight. That space merchant marine was just starting to deliver things like GPS and SATCOM and missile warning in very rudimentary ways. But then we moved forward, and I myself was involved in I was assigned to U.S. Air Forces in Europe during the Kosovo campaign in 1999. It's actually where I first met General Wright while I was in that assignment. And we had taken it to another notch. I was working in the AOC there as a young captain, and we were bringing space capabilities again into planning, into air campaign planning, and into the objectives for the overall operation in a way that was much further ahead than what we had done in Desert Storm. And then we fast forward another 10 years, and if General Raymond were here, it was about the time that he was spending time in the desert as a DER Space 4 in CENTCOM, integrating space into the fight at yet another level of capability. And then if I could describe where we are today, it is even further along. Space capabilities are more important than they've ever been to the joint warfight, to all domains using space capabilities. That has continued on a linear and almost exponential curve, and it doesn't show signs of slowing down. So we had to be good as that merchant marine, and we're going to have to continue to be even better in the days ahead on delivering those space capabilities to the fight. I spent most of my career doing that, right? Optimizing GPS for operations, optimizing SATCOM, optimizing ISR products to get into warfighters' hands as quickly as we could. But now it's no longer a placid ocean that we're operating under. It is no longer a benign domain. It's under threat. And so in addition to the merchant marine, we got to keep driving space capabilities into the fight. We now need a Navy. We need to be able to protect our capabilities as they operate in that space domain that was once benign but is now under threat, while still developing and delivering those capabilities to joint warfighters. So with that as kind of an analogy where we are, how do we do that? How do we stand up a Navy at the same time we're continuing to develop this merchant marine capability set? And that's kind of, it's with that backdrop that I would propose there's kind of 4 challenges that I would lay out that I'm thinking about in my joint hat. The first is we have to get ever better space domain awareness. We're actually using that term now rather than space situational awareness. It's a more doctrinally normalized term with the other domains. How do we understand what is going on in the space domain, especially with it being under threat and with activities becoming more and more complex than they've ever been? You know, I've heard General Brown at PACAF talk about the tyranny of distance in the Indo-PACOM AOR. In space, we have a tyranny of volume. And boy, is it huge when you think that we're probably looking out as far as the lunar sphere right now, and maybe even further in years to come. So we have that. We have increased capabilities. We just brought online the space fence back at the end of March. This is a state-of-the-art radar that we have out on Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific that is going to make it much easier and more dynamic way to track targets in orbit. And it's already, as we're starting to use it, we're already seeing great benefits from that capability. But at the same time, things are getting more complex. Even from a relatively benign perspective, we're seeing more and more activity in the space domain. Just over the weekend, 58 more Starlink satellites launched by SpaceX into orbit. I think their total now is well over 530 Starlink satellites on orbit. And if you can imagine the folks here at the 18th Space Control Squadron here at Vandenberg whose mission it is to track what's going on in Earth's orbit, to have that many new objects out there and maneuvering, and each time a launch, another 60 or so come off of the launch vehicle and start moving on their own into their deployed locations. It's a whole new problem set, and they've been great at it. The 18th Space Control Squadron has been doing great work at being able to quickly identify where these satellites are and catalog them and understand how they fit into a bigger space traffic management picture. But it is more complex than it's been in the past. And then you overlay on top of that potential threats, and it really gets complex quickly. And just two recent examples in the last 6 months that everyone has heard General Raymond talk about publicly, the Russians launching what we understand to be a anti-satellite capability in low Earth orbit back in December, and even more recently in April, launching a direct ascent anti-satellite vehicle for a test as well. These kinds of things make it even more imperative that we understand what's going on in the space domain. But this challenge for us is integrated with the broader challenge of other domains, understanding what is going on. General Goldfein did a tremendous job, I thought, at AFA last fall with walking through what joint all-domain command and control would be for the warfighter. And every warfighter would have a different need or a different perspective on how to understand, why using all domains to understand what's going on in their particular operational picture. And it's no different for space. Space domain awareness requires an all-domain approach to it. It's just maybe inverted from what we might normally think about a terrestrial domain challenge. So not only do we need to understand what's going on in space, but specifically as the CIFSEC commander, I will be interested in knowing if there are jammers aboard is as relevant to space as it is to any of the domains, and we're as eager to be part of that broader capability set as it moves forward, because it'll help us with the space domain awareness challenge. The second challenge we have is kind of I alluded to already. How do we continue to deliver space capabilities to the warfighter, giving that ever-growing importance of space to joint warfighting across the spectrum of conflict, from the smallest tactical operation in the special ops arena to what STRATCOM and Air Force Global Strike Command deal with in their world. And how do we make sure we continue to grow capabilities along those lines? One of the critical pieces to getting this done and being successful is partnerships. And I like to say that here at Vandenberg, we're sort of a nexus of partnerships in many ways. And I'll tick through a few of those. First, I think we're coming to learn, particularly in space, that the acquisition arena is part of the battle space. And so I actually have people from General J.T. Thompson's organization just down the coast from me, and based headquartered there in Los Angeles, working on the floor with the folks here at the CSPOC to develop the next tools that we need to really understand what's going on in space, and then to effectively command and control a space fight. And so we're learning how to do that in a DevOps environment in new ways that we have never done before. A second line of partnering that is vital to us is with the commercial sector. It extends back into the acquisition arena, but also extends forward. We have our commercial integration cell here at Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is a number of companies, mostly SATCOM at this point, but also including one ISR from space company, that actually we're partnering with to better understand what they're seeing from their operations, and they can see what we're seeing from our operations, and making a partnership on that a better way to more quickly identify and then resolve challenges at the speed of war. And I consider that'll be vital moving forward, and I expect that will be a growth area for us. And then also extremely important to us in terms of partnerships are international partnerships. I've said before, I'm very proud of the combined in my joint duty title, Combined Force Space Component Commander, because of the weight that carries with regard to our partnering with our international partners. And we've been doing that in ways beyond anything would have exceeded my expectations from just a few years ago. Today we have the deputy director of our CSPOC is a UK colonel So we are already we're a combined organization here at Vandenberg. We have liaison officers from Germany and France and the UK here on site, with we expect more to come. We have exchange officers throughout our enterprise from the Five Eyes nations. And I expect, and we're continuing to look at partnerships with other nations too. We're looking at a space domain awareness payload that's going to launch on the Japanese QZSS satellites here in the next few years. And just most recently signed an SSA sharing agreement with Peru to make that, I think, the 25th nation that we have SSA sharing agreements with on agreement to have a good conduit for the exchange of information on things that are going in the space domain. So all those partnerships together are going to get us to a way to deliver space capabilities in ways that joint warfighters need them today and will need them in the days to come. Third challenge is kind of alluding back to if this last challenge about delivering space capabilities was that merchant marine and continue to drive in on that. The next is about this Navy. How do we pursue space superiority? How do we find the right ways to deter attacks against our space capabilities and then defend in the instance that it comes to it that we need to? And so if we return to my maritime analogy, for again decades, many of our satellites, especially those of geosynchronous orbit, were built to be in a benign domain. They were not built to be in a domain where they may be under threat. And they are analogous to, in the maritime domain today, super tankers and mega container ships, right? Built for efficiency. They're big. They can't maneuver very well, but they're built for efficiency and delivering of effects. Always kind of built under the assumption they wouldn't be under threat. Well, I'm not sure that I would want to be on a mega container ship and have to evade torpedoes. There might be a way I could get lucky once or twice, but it's probably it's a real challenge. And so what do we need to do with our capabilities in the space domain to make them more defensible? Do we need to evolve fast freighters? Do we need to evolve escorts? So we're in the very middle of thinking about that in terms of our future architectures to ensure that we aren't vulnerable in our space capabilities moving forward. And then I would say the fourth challenge is probably the most important one of all, and that is developing our next generation of space warfighters, the people, the human capital piece. And in some ways, that's the most exciting one for us to work with. So even before there was the U.S. Space Force, we'd been thinking hard about how do we do this better. And our undergraduate space training, which actually occurs right here at Vandenberg Air Force Base for both officers and enlisted, we started last October with a whole new course that nearly doubled its length and added in new classification levels that were not there before. And yet, I think at this point, it may already be a little behind where we need to be with a Space Force and where we've come in just a really short time. So we'll be looking really hard at how we get ahead at that and how we continue to evolve training for our newest sessions, as well as continued development training throughout the career of a member of the Space Force. We also need to vastly improve our modeling and simulation. That does include simulators. We really don't have simulators today in which to train our folks. We need to develop those. And we need better modeling and simulation capabilities where we can actually model a potential conflict and fight, change some variables, conduct war games, and do this at a scale and scope that we have not really done up to at this point. And then there's I'm starting to get into the OT&E side here, but then there's how do we actually recruit the best people into the Space Force? I think there's a tremendous opportunity. That I think there's a large interest in space in our nation. I think that will continue, and I think there's a possibility we can tap into parts of the nation to be part of the Space Force that we maybe haven't thought about in more traditional ways of recruiting. So how can we get after that? It's a challenge that we're focused on, and again, I think that's a pretty exciting one to look at. Okay, I'm going to try to turn it over to some Q&A here shortly, but let me just kind of switch gears just a little bit and talk a little bit my Space Force hat. So most of what I talked to was from my perspective as commander of CIFSEC, but I'm still, at this point, I'm the commander of Space Operations Command, what was 14th Air Force, which at this point still has all of the operational wings that are in our U.S. Space Force, that was 14th Air Force, fall under me in that regard. And so on that side, we're basically figuring out how do we, now that we're a Space Force, how do we build a new service from scratch? And that is a tremendous opportunity that's afforded us a chance to really think hard about what does space warfighting of the future look like? How can we organize, train, and equip for that? How can we present forces, perhaps in a way we hadn't thought of before, to U.S. Space Command, which in turn, when they get, TACON down to me as CIFSEC, or to my colleague at Joint Task Force Space Defense, Brigadier General Tom James, the other component in U.S. Space Command. How can we look at that and reinvent that in a way that we've never done before? And we've been working very hard on that. I know a lot of what's probably been in the news with regard to Space Force and in the Twitterverse since it stood up in December is uniforms and flags and such things. But we've been working really hard behind the scenes on, no kidding, space warfighting. How do we optimize the service to organize, train, equip, and present space warfighting forces for the warfighter? And we have a number of plans that are in motion that are not yet fully approved, but I would hope by the end of the summer, or if not sooner, there'll be some major announcements about things we're going to do within the Space Force to realign. More specific things we're looking at is how many echelons of command do you really need? And we may be able to reduce one or two to be a really truly lean warfighting organization for the 21st century. I guess another point I wanted to make is because I know there are a lot of questions about Space Force out there, they continually come, and realize that we're not even 6 months old, right? I mentioned a couple weeks ago in a different webinar, the Space Force was born on the eve of the winter solstice, and we haven't hit the summer solstice yet. That comes this coming weekend, so not even 6 months old. And we've made, actually, I think, a significant amount of progress in thinking of ourselves as a separate service and where we're headed. And it's worth, I started to do a little self-education reading about, the Army Air Corps when it first began to emerge as a separate branch within the Army and eventually a separate branch of the service in 1947. And I look forward to the day reading the book that compares the two, how both services evolved in their similarities and their differences. In some ways, there have been a lot of similarities. We've just been seemingly moving a lot more quickly. It's amazing to read when you look back at the early days of the Army Air Corps, the amount of interest, public interest that was in there, as we have today with the Space Force, the amount of interest that Congress had from year to year that exists today with the Space Force, and the amount of interest that the presidency had too. So lots of similarities, kind of exciting to see that we're kind of charting this new course in the tradition of the U.S. Air Force. So with that, General Wright, I think I'll stop talking and see if so we'll get to some questions here.
Well, thanks, General Shaw. As usual, outstanding. We could probably talk to you for hours. We've got limited time, and I know this will also be a foundation for you to continue to follow up, both with the media and certainly across our Air Force and across the defense industry. Let's start out with Rachel Cohen for the fact that she sort of works for me on our Air Force magazine, and then we'll have time to be very fair and give other members of our media who are so important to us to tell the story. So we'll focus on the media, starting with Rachel.
Hi, sir. Thanks for doing this. So you talked a little bit about training already, and I'm curious how you're approaching training now that Space Flag has been canceled because of COVID. And do you have any insight as well into, of course, now I can't remember what STARCOM stands for, but the new Training and Readiness Command, how that's going to address things like BMT, which is starting in October, is what I've heard, and the things like modeling and sim that you mentioned.
So that's a lot of things you packed into one question there. So you are talking about Space Training and Readiness Command, which we expect will be part of those. Hasn't been fully approved yet, but if approved, would be a separate command apart from Space Operations Command and our Acquisition Command that would be focused on developing warfighter expertise and training, really focused on the human capital side. With regard to, so Space Flag was, regrettable. We had to cancel Space Flag in April, and to be frank, where so The good thing about the COVID crisis from a space perspective is we continue to do our mission day in and day out. 24/7, 365, we continue to deliver GPS, we continue to deliver MelSatcom, ISR from space, continue to operate our SSA payloads in space to see what we continue to do that, and really we didn't miss a beat. And that might be in slight contrast to the air side, which had to, I think, reduce some sorties, reduce some training and such. So operationally, we continue to move forward. Where we did suffer some impact was in some of the other longer term activities such as training. You know, we weren't getting the same people through the training pipeline, through various training pipelines. And we're starting to adjust that back again, along with so many other things across the Department of Defense that are starting to kind of try to get back to where we were pre-COVID. Space flag, we missed that opportunity. That was just one of many kinds of training activities and benefits, and I hope that the next one will be able to keep on track. For those that are wondering what a space flag is, it's a scenario that we present to some of our space operators, a problem, and they have to go solve it, and then they outbrief it to some senior leadership. I've been on the receiving end of some of those outbriefs, and it's some truly good thinking that goes on in those space flags. So we missed that opportunity. I hope we can get that in the future. Okay, I'm trying to think, Rach, if I hit all the pieces from your training and your STARCOM question.
Do you have any insight into how BMT is going to work with?
So we need those capabilities, and that would be, I think, the greatest champion of them would be STARCOM. That would be a crucial part of how we develop Space Force fighting expertise.
Thanks, Rachel. And to be fair to the rest of our attendees, let's go to Sandra Irwin, and then looks like Al Moore is up from industry. So Sandra.
Oh, hello. How are you?
Great.
What is your assessment of the 8,500 people that have volunteered to join the Space Force? Have you had a chance to look at the applicants? Any sense of, are you getting the people that you want? Are you getting all the space operators, the intelligence people, all the people with the expertise that you were hoping for? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. No, I understand the question. I think when we had our webinar that you led 2 weeks ago, I think I'm not much further from that, from what I said there 2 weeks ago, and that was, yes, we did have 8,500. The requirements that we had for uniform personnel are just short of 7,000. So it sounds like we did better, right? Mm-hmm. What I have not seen is a detailed breakdown of the career fields and the seniority levels within those career fields of the applicants and how that would stack up against our requirements. I know that, in fact, I know that exact process is going on maybe right at this minute in the Pentagon with our folks there, sifting through that and kind of getting an assessment of, okay, how do we go forward on now adjudicating who should move into the Space Force out of the applicants. So the statistician in me, without any inside knowledge, the statistician and engineer in me would say, my guess is there are some of those boxes in those career pyramids and different career fields that we're doing well, and some that we didn't get enough. And so it'd just be a matter of figuring out how to move forward, and then doing what we can with that first set of human capital. But I think another thing to point out is that this is just the beginning. Mm-hmm. You know, this is less than 6 months into the Space Force, and we've already identified 8,500 people that want to come in against roughly 6,700 current requirements. There will be, I noticed in the draft congressional language that came out last week that there was a provision to allow voluntary transfer into the Space Force. I don't know exactly what that will look like in the final bill if it makes it. That was just draft language. But that will be interesting, and perhaps another round 2 of how to maybe get at any shortcomings we might see. I mentioned that as a possibility. So more to come. I don't have any more definitive answer than I think I gave you 2 weeks ago, Sandra. I apologize.
Great. No, that's okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Let's go to industry. Al Moore, I saw you up early on.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, General Shaw. Thanks for joining me and continuing to share publicly about your mission. Could you give us a little insight, perhaps, into how you think your command and the Space Force will participate and evolve in the advanced battle management system activity, sir? Thank you.
I think that my best answer to that is probably what I already said with regard to joint all-domain command and control. So to the extent that we advance the ball on, perhaps I didn't describe enough what, for those that maybe missed General Goldfein's pitch at AFA last fall. And by the way, there was language in this, specific language about JADC2 in the draft SASC language as well from last week that, as I remember, specifically told the JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council in the Pentagon, to look at JADC2 requirements, and specifically, again, this was draft language, asked the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to weigh in with an assessment of whether we had that right, given, and I attribute that language to the fact that General Goldfein had come on publicly at AFA and talked about JADC2 in such a passionate and convincing way. And so, but this is the idea that we can't operate in stovepipes in our domains anymore. We can't have an air domain picture that maybe sort of filters to the maritime domain and you know, through some pipelines, but not all. We can't have a maritime domain picture that we don't have an understanding of in the space domain. And I would allude to the example I gave of an EMI jammer in the maritime environment. If they're aware of it, we want to be aware of it. And so how do we get at that? Air battle management system will be, I think, it's a success of that will be based on how well we do joint all-domain command and control.
Tony Rock.
Hey, thanks, Orville. Really appreciate it. So General Shaw, this is a question I'd like to revisit the operationally relevant training and exercise environment that you talked about in Space Flag. It strikes me that there's a political military portion of this that, unlike Red Flag or the Army's NTC, where the political decisions have already been made and you're just going into operations, that there's some real thorny policy questions, much like the cyber world. The space world, you're working in a global commercial domain, which gets back to your merchant marine analogy that you use. So my question is, during Space Flag, do you have either role players or do you have actual representatives from folks like Department of State and other US governmental agencies and or from industry understanding the sensitivity of security clearances because of the both intended and unintended consequences in the global commercial domain?
Yeah, Tony, good question. So the space flags that I've seen have been at a pretty tactical level and did not have role players really above the lower level, the operational environment, right? It was presenting a tactical problem. For example, you know, this satellite is being approacted by an unknown object, or maybe two unknown objects. What do you do to maybe defend it or to complicate an adversary calculus or something along those lines, more of a tactical. However, I would say that the forum by which we best tee up these policy level questions, and we do have role players that walk through that, is the Schriever war game. So if for those in the audience that are familiar, hopefully you're nodding your heads. For those that you're not, this is a war game that's been ongoing since the early 2000s, but every year seems to get better. And usually its purpose, it's once a year. We do have some events that lead up to the main event that's usually in the fall. We're still trying to do it this year. I haven't heard the latest on if we're going to try to go all in or do it virtually or how we're actually going to try to pull it off this year. But and we also involve international partners, by the way. But those tend to tee up those exact kinds of questions, either from a national or even an international context of policy. What's a hostile act in space, and how do we respond either nationally or even internationally in an allied way to those threats? So Tony, I hope I'm answering your question. It wouldn't be. I think the space flags, they have certain assumptions written into them at that tactical level. It says, hey, assume that you can do this, or assume you've been given this guidance to go and work at this. And sometimes we try to pull the gloves off on that. What might be what we think is a policy constraint today, we kind of challenge our warfighters to think, what would you do if that wasn't a constraint? And we learn from that. And then we go forward. So, and I think you allude a little bit to modeling and simulation, just a little. I think, let me, in case there's some more questions about that. The simulators or emulators that we use today are basically offline versions of the command and control consoles that we use to command and control our satellites. And they tend to just kind of, they're very closed system in that regard. If you send a command, then it'll kind of show what happens with that command, or you can put in the systems in these emulators something that might be wrong with the satellite and have the operator kind of identify that and send commands. What we don't really have a very good ability to do is to do multiple platforms interacting with one another at the speed of war, and that's something we need to evolve to. So when I talk about modeling and simulation, it's probably involving multiple platforms in the face of threats. What do we do?
Thanks, sir. Sean Stuger has your hand up. I'm figuring out how to do this. This is working. Thanks, Sean.
Hi, General Shaw. How are you today?
Hey, Sean. Good to see you again.
Good to hear you, sir. And thank you so much for spending the time with us today. I just have two questions for you. The first one, how are you getting your requirements fulfilled for ABMS and SDA? Are you leveraging SMC, Space RCO, SDA for their respective requirements, or all of the above?
I think the answer is all of the above, and we'll take all the help we can get. But let me get a little bit more specific. So space domain awareness, this is really going to be a good question if we get General J.T. Thompson or folks that work for him in a future forum similar to this one. But trying to, again, take the modeling and simulation to another extreme. I know that the folks working for General Thompson are setting up a space domain awareness sandbox where we can allow users and perhaps even commercial organizations to leverage the unified data library that is, again, part of the broader JADC2 construct that we're developing to kind of rapidly develop predictive analytic tools, other kinds of tools that'll be useful to us in the space domain awareness environment. And so I'm heavily reliant on those kinds of environments that the acquisition community is bringing forward for us to be able to kind of experiment in, send representatives to participate in various exercises and other experiments in those environments. I guess this would be a good time for me to say that I don't think we should limit our horizon to just our own national acquisition organizations. So as part of our international partnering, we're trying to leverage capabilities that other nations are developing. And we were just in a conversation a couple weeks ago with the United Kingdom on some space capabilities they think they can develop and tools that they can develop in their own environment that then we could import and use across all of the allied, our allied networks and use operationally. So, so I guess my answer to you, John, is I'll take whatever help we can get from any sector that it comes from. And you listed a few acquisition organizations. I think there's a few more we could pile on to that, right?
Understand, sir.
So
understand. And the second question I have: do you believe that the Hill and the Department of Air Force will come to an agreement in the 21 time frame on the acquisition makeup for USSF?
Yeah, I think so. So that's sort of the, so when I looked at the readout from the SASC NDAA draft, that was kind of the big dog that wasn't barking in that was the acquisition piece. And so I don't want to speculate on where we are other than I just observed, oh, that's missing. And that is a huge piece of what we're going to need. So I anticipate we'll see a lot of that moving forward. Sean, it's a good question. I was actually a little surprised there wasn't more acquisition language in the draft NDAA.
Thank you again, sir.
Thanks, sir. If I could ask a question just in the context of the Air Force Association's support for really our leading space warfighter, General John Shaw. Is the threat real? What would you say, certainly at the unclassified level, about the reality of the threat to America's and our allies' vital interests in space?
The threat is absolutely real. And the fact that General Raymond is what he's able to talk about publicly are the leading indicators of those threats. And I would go back to, the ones that jump to mind, the ones I already mentioned here today. He came out pretty publicly back in December with regard to the Russian activity in low Earth orbit, stalking a government satellite. we had our eyes on that very closely. We're watching it very closely, and it's concerning. And then again, the recent ASAT test in April, another clear indicator that space is a contested domain. And that's what we talk about publicly. I'll leave it at that, General Wright, but
Well,
there is, we need to be prepared to not be surprised in a future crisis of what might happen in space.
that's great. Obviously, you are the warfighter looking the threat in the eye. Last question we have time for before we shift. Major General Retired Roger Teague.
Sorry, I thought I was there. Orville, General Shaw, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for your leadership and continued support. We are very proud of all that you're doing. If I could just pick up on your last question there, given the limited ability to talk about the threat, how can industry help communicate that message? I don't think that the average American understands the very real threats that your team faces on a daily basis, and America needs to understand that you know, the vulnerabilities that we're challenged with.
I think so. I'll give an example. You know, I could get there. There's a wide range of threats. I'm reminded, I think General Hayton did a great job of this about 2 years ago, where he kind of laid out publicly about the wide range of threats that we're facing that start at one end with you know, electromagnetic jammers, and at the other end it could be a nuclear explosion in space, right? And everything that could happen in between. These are all potential threats to our space capabilities. And you know, why are they under threat? Because of what we've done over the last number of decades on making space capabilities so important to joint warfighting that an adversary sees what we've done, and that's why they're under threat. What can industry do? I'll zero in on an example that may be unsatisfying, and that would be one of the things we do see routinely is electromagnetic interference on our SATCOM networks. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's purposeful, and it could come across a variety of places on the spectrum and from a variety of sources. So it would be, and I know that our SATCOM partners in commercial industry are better than they've ever been when providing SATCOM service at identifying interference and getting around that so that they maintain service to their customers. So a nirvana of sorts would be in the future where we are working with commercial partners. Let's just say SATCOM is an example where if some sort of interference is detected, we're immediately aware of it, all of us together, and we work together to figure out where is it, what can be done about it. Part of that reaction to that is going to be moving perhaps a user to a different satellite or a different part of the frequency band that they have access to that won't be affected. And another part of solving the problem might be to drop a bomb on it. Don't expect commercial to do that for us, but that would be something we would do. But together, we would find ways to take care of that problem. And that's just SATCOM. And so if we kind of extrapolate that across all of the industry sectors, if your capability is under threat, how would you know it? And how can we share that as quickly as we can in a partnered way? So that would be the beginning of my answer to that question. If I thought more about it, General Teague, I'm sure I could give you a much better answer.
Thank you, John.
Well, thanks, sir. It's time to wrap up and shift to the next chat room, if you will. You've got 75 plus participants today who would normally fill this room. This is the next best thing. As I've said before, we can't thank you enough for your leadership and your care for our airmen, our Space Force professionals, and their families around the world in a tough and increasingly tough fight with a real threat, again, to America's vital interests. Thanks for your leadership. Thanks for your time with us. And AFA is certainly on your wing at 17,000 miles per hour or faster. God bless, and we'll shift to the next phase.
Okay, thanks, General Wright. Honored to be part of the inaugural session here for this new series that AFA is doing. Thank you for doing it.
Thanks.